Find somewhere comfortable. You don't need to sit up straight or hold any particular position. If you're already lying down, that's exactly right. If your eyes are heavy, let them close. You don't need to follow closely tonight. You don't need to hold on to any of this. Just let the words come to you the way warmth comes when you pull a blanket a little tighter. Quietly, without effort, whatever today was. And only you know what it was. It's behind you now. The hours you spent, the things you carried, the conversations that went well or didn't, the small worries and the larger ones. All of it is settling, the way sediment settles in still water. You don't have to do anything with any of it tonight. We're going to travel somewhere together, back through time actually. A long way back, further than most journeys go. We're going to trace the slow, ancient story of something human beings have been doing for longer than any written record can fully account for. The practice of turning inward, of sitting with the self, of finding in stillness something that couldn't be reached any other way. 10,000 years is a long time. It's longer than every civilization you learned about in school. Longer than the pyramids, longer than written language, longer than the wheel. And yet, through all of that time, across every culture and every continent, human beings kept returning to this same quiet practice, kept sitting down, kept closing their eyes, kept going inside. There's something worth wondering about in that. We'll wonder about it together, slowly, without any hurry at all. You don't need to remember any of this. You don't need to take notes or stay awake for the important parts. There are no important parts, not in that way. This is just a long, slow walk through something very old and very beautiful. You're welcome to drift at any point. The story will still be here, moving gently forward, whether you're fully with it or somewhere softer. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench if it was clenched. Let the weight of your body be held by whatever is beneath you. We're in no hurry tonight. Somewhere in what is now northern India and Pakistan, in a valley carved by one of the oldest river systems on earth, a person sat down. We don't know their name. We don't know if they were young or old, a farmer or a teacher, a parent or a wanderer. We know almost nothing about them at all except for one thing. They sat in a particular way, with a stillness that was clearly intentional, and someone thought it was worth preserving. Not in words, because words weren't yet being written down. The cave drawings of the Indus Valley, some of them dating back to around 5,000 years before the Common Era, show human figures in postures that any meditation teacher today would immediately recognize. Cross-legged, upright but relaxed, hands resting. Eyes, if you look closely enough, turned inward. The posture of someone who has gone somewhere that doesn't require moving. 5,000 years ago, perhaps even older than that. The scholars who study these images suggest the practice itself may be even more ancient than the drawings, passed down through gesture and example and breath long before anyone thought to carve it into rock. There is something quietly astonishing in that. Not astonishing in a loud way. Astonishing in the way that a very deep lake is astonishing when you stand at the edge and realize you can't see the bottom. Human beings, it seems, have always known that the noise of the world was not the whole of the world. That beneath the surface of thinking, beneath the planning and the worrying and the remembering, there was something else, something quieter, and that it was worth going to find. That impulse, that ancient turning inward, is what we're following tonight. From those first stone-carved figures, all the way to laboratories in California where scientists are measuring what happens to the brain when someone sits in exactly the same way, thousands of years later and simply breathes. The story, as far as written records go, begins with a collection of texts called the Vedas. The Vedas are among the oldest written documents in human history. They were composed in Sanskrit, the language of ancient India, and the earliest of them were committed to writing around 1500 years before the Common Era. But here is what makes them particularly interesting for our purposes. The teachings they contain are far older than the writing itself. They were passed down orally from teacher to student, generation after generation, for centuries before anyone wrote them down. The meditation practices described in the Vedas had already been refined and transmitted across many lifetimes before the first scribe pressed stylus to clay. What the Vedas describe, among many other things, is a practice they call dhyana. The word is often translated simply as meditation, but the original meaning is something richer than that. It carries within it the sense of sustained attention, of a mind that has learned to rest on a single point without scattering. A mind that has, through practice, become like still water rather than a river in flood. The Vedic tradition understood something that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to measure in laboratories, that the ordinary, untrained mind is not a peaceful place. It jumps and scatters, it revisits the past and anticipates the future, it narrates, it judges, it worries. The ancient teachers called this the monkey mind, and they were not being unkind. They were not being unkind. They were not being unkind. Dhyana was the antidote, not a suppression of thought, but a gentle, patient training of attention. Sit. Observe. When the mind wanders, notice that it has wandered and return. Sit again. Observe again. It sounds simple. It is not simple. But it is, as practitioners across 50 centuries have discovered, possible. Around 1,000 years after those first Vedic texts were written, a man sat beneath a tree in what is now the northern part of India, and something happened to him that changed the course of human history. His name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince by most accounts, born into comfort and then profoundly unsettled by an encounter with suffering, with illness, with old age, with death, that his privileged life had tried to shield him from. He left his palace. He wandered. He studied with the great teachers of his time, learned their methods, pushed those methods to their limits, and found that they didn't quite take him where he needed to go. And then he sat down beneath a tree. A fig tree, a Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. And he resolved not to rise until he had found what he was looking for. What he found, after a long night of what the texts describe as both profound stillness and profound inner struggle, was something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and teach. He called it enlightenment or awakening, a direct recognition of the nature of the mind, a seeing through the ordinary noise of thought to something clear and vast underneath. His method, the method he taught for decades afterward, was meditation. Specifically, a form of meditation centered on close, non-judgmental attention to the present moment, to the breath, to the body, to the arising and passing of thoughts, observed not as the truth of who you are, but as passing events, like clouds moving through a very large sky. This is the tradition that would eventually travel across Asia, carried by monks and scholars and pilgrims, taking root in China and Japan and Tibet and Korea and Southeast Asia, each culture adapting it, deepening it, adding its own colors and textures. Each culture finding, in its own way, that the thing Siddhartha had pointed toward was real and worth the sitting. Around the same time, in a different part of the world entirely, another tradition of inward practice was taking shape. In ancient China, a philosophy called Taoism was developing, associated with a figure called Laozi and a text called the Tao Te Ching. The meditative practices that grew from Taoism had a different flavor from the Indian traditions, but the underlying gesture was recognizably the same. Quiet the noise. Find the deep current. Rest in it. Two traditions arising independently on opposite sides of a vast continent pointing toward the same quiet place. That is perhaps the most patient argument for the reality of what meditation points toward. When people who have never met, who speak different languages and pray to different conceptions of the divine, independently discover the same practice and describe arriving at the same quality of inner stillness, there is something worth taking seriously in that convergence, something ancient and patient waiting to be found. For many centuries, the contemplative traditions of the East developed largely within their own worlds, deepening and branching and flowering in ways that were unknown to the civilizations of the Mediterranean and Europe. But the impulse toward inner stillness was not absent from the West. It simply wore different clothes. In the Jewish mystical tradition known as Kabbalah, practitioners developed elaborate methods of contemplation, focusing the mind on the sacred letters of the Hebrew alphabet, on the names of the divine, on the intricate map of what the Kabbalists called the Sephirot, the 10 aspects of the divine nature through which they believed the infinite made itself knowable. In the Christian tradition, a practice emerged in the Eastern Orthodox Church that its practitioners called hesychasm, from the Greek word for stillness. The hesychast monks, many of them living in isolated communities on the rocky peninsula of Mount Athos in what is now Greece, practiced a form of prayer that was less about speaking to God and more about listening. More about becoming quiet enough to hear. Their central technique was the repetition of a short phrase, the Jesus Prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Repeated in rhythm with the breath over and over. The hesychast tradition developed most fully between the 10th and 14th centuries, and its practitioners wrote at length about the inner states they encountered, a warmth in the heart, a quality of light, a profound peace that they understood as the presence of God. Modern researchers, reading those descriptions, note their remarkable resemblance to the states described by meditators in completely different traditions. The language is different. The theology is different. In the Islamic tradition, the Sufi mystics developed their own contemplative practices centered on the remembrance of God, what they called dhikr, the repetition of divine names. The turning of the whole self toward the divine presence. Sufi teachers wrote poetry of extraordinary beauty about the experience of inner stillness, about the dissolution of the small self into something vast and loving. The poet Rumi, perhaps the most widely read Sufi master, described the inner life in images that have traveled across 8 centuries and still land with quiet force tonight. What is remarkable, looking across these traditions, is not their differences. It is their family resemblance, the quieting of ordinary mental noise, the focusing of attention on a single point, the patient return again and again when the mind wanders, the gradual uncovering through practice of something underneath the noise that feels more fundamental, more restful, more true. Human beings, it seems, have been finding this same quiet place from many different directions for a very long time. And then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, something changed. The texts of the Eastern traditions began to travel west, translated into European languages by scholars who were, in many cases, genuinely astonished by what they found. The Upanishads, the ancient philosophical commentaries on the Vedas, were translated into Latin in the early 19th century, and the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, reading them, said they had been the consolation of his life and would be the consolation of his death. Ralph Waldo Emerson read them and was transformed. The East was meeting the West, slowly, on the page. And the meeting was quietly changing both. The first great bridge builder between the Eastern traditions and the modern Western world arrived at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in the year 1893. His name was Swami Vivekananda. He was a young Indian monk, a student of the great mystic Ramakrishna, and he had traveled to Chicago to represent the Hindu tradition at a gathering that was, by any measure, unprecedented. Religious leaders from across the world had assembled in one building. Vivekananda, when he rose to speak, addressed the audience simply, "Brothers and sisters of America." The hall erupted. He hadn't yet said anything else. Just those 5 words. The warmth in them, the inclusion, the assumption of kinship rather than distance. The audience gave. He went on to speak about the universal nature of spiritual experience, about the deep commonality beneath the surface differences of religion, about the practices of yoga and meditation as technologies of the inner life available to any human being, regardless of their faith. He was a sensation. He toured America and Europe, teaching, writing, founding centers of study. In the early 20th century, Swami Vivekananda's work was followed by others. Paramahansa Yogananda arrived in America in 1920 and spent decades teaching yoga and meditation, eventually writing Autobiography of a Yogi, a book that would go on to influence generations of Western seekers, including, famously, Steve Jobs, who read it every year of his adult life and requested that it be distributed at his memorial. And then, in the 1960s, a small, gentle man with a long white beard and a gift for making the profound feel accessible brought meditation into the living rooms of a generation. Maharishi. The Beatles met Maharishi in 1967 at a lecture in London and then travelled to his ashram in Rishikesh, India, to study with him directly. The photographs of John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison sitting in meditation in the foothills of the Himalayas circled the world. Suddenly, meditation was not something remote and foreign. It was something your favorite musicians did. Something that felt, at least potentially, available. Millions of people learned TM in the years that followed. Research began to accumulate. Scientists started to ask, seriously, what was actually happening in the brain and body when someone sat in this way? The ancient practice was entering the laboratory. And there, something remarkable began to unfold. John Kabat-Zinn was a molecular biologist working at the University of Massachusetts Medical School in the 1970s when he had what he later described as a vision, though he might have used a more scientific word for it. He was a long-time meditator, trained in the Zen and Vipassana traditions, and he found himself wondering whether the practical, clinical benefits of meditation could be separated from their religious context and offered to people who were suffering. In 1979, he established the mindfulness-based stress reduction program known as MBSR at the University of Massachusetts. What happened in those early groups was, by clinical standards, remarkable. Pain levels dropped, anxiety decreased, sleep improved. Patients reported feeling more capable of navigating their own inner experience, less at the mercy of their thoughts and feelings. They were, in a measurable way, better. Kabat-Zinn published his findings. Other researchers took notice. The studies began to multiply. And what they found, over the following decades, using increasingly sophisticated tools, began to rewrite what scientists thought they knew about the brain. The first thing to understand is that the brain, for a very long time, was thought to be essentially fixed in adulthood. You were born with a certain number of neurons. They formed their connections in childhood and adolescence, and after that the structure was more or less set. What you had was what you had. This turned out to be wrong. The brain is plastic. Neuroplasticity is the word scientists use for the brain's remarkable capacity to change its own structure and function in response to experience. And meditation, it turns out, is one of the most reliable ways to induce those changes. Researchers began using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to watch the brain during meditation. What they found was that meditation consistently reduced activity in a network of brain regions called the default mode network. And here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Studies suggest that the default mode network is active for roughly half of our waking lives. Half. We spend approximately 50% of our conscious hours not fully present to whatever is actually happening, but lost in the inner narrative, the self-referential loop of thought. A 2016 analysis of 61 people confirmed that regular meditation produced significant and lasting reductions in default mode network activity, not just during the meditation itself, but at rest. The brain, trained by practice, became quieter even when it wasn't meditating. The structural changes were equally striking. Long-term meditators were found to have increased cortical thickness in areas of the brain associated with attention, emotional regulation, and sensory processing. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of what we might call our most thoughtful, considered selves, grew thicker with practice. The insula, the region involved in awareness of bodily sensations and empathy, became more developed. The anterior cingulate cortex, which plays a role in self-regulation and the capacity to hold competing options in mind without being overwhelmed, showed measurable change. The amygdala, that ancient deep brain structure that processes fear and threat, became less reactive, less quick to fire, less prone to flooding the system with stress hormones at the first sign of something uncertain or uncomfortable. People who meditated regularly didn't stop having difficult emotions, but they became less hijacked by them. The emotion would arise, and there would be, between the arising and the response, a small but crucial gap. The hippocampus, the region so central to memory and learning, was found to be larger in long-term meditators. And researchers began to explore something even more far-reaching, the possibility that meditation might slow the cellular aging process itself, through its effects on structures called telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes that shorten as we age. The evidence is still accumulating, still being refined, but the possibility that sitting quietly and attending to the breath might have consequences at the cellular level is one of those findings that takes a moment to fully absorb. The brain's chemistry was changing too. Meditators showed higher levels of GABA, the neurotransmitter associated with calm, with the quieting of neural activity, with the reduction of anxiety. Serotonin, which regulates mood and the sense of well-being, was elevated. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of pleasure and motivation, rose. The brain was, in a measurable way, becoming a more pleasant place to live. And the brain waves themselves were shifting. EEG studies showed that meditation moved the brain away from the faster beta wave frequencies associated with active, sometimes anxious thinking, toward the slower, more restful alpha waves associated with a relaxed and open awareness. Deeper states of meditation were associated with theta waves, the frequencies of drowsiness and deep inner absorption. The frequencies of drowsiness and deep inner absorption. The frequencies your brain moves through as you fall asleep. Some of the most experienced meditators showed patterns that resembled, in certain respects, the brain states of very deep sleep. That is a remarkable thing. To be simultaneously awake and in a state that resembles sleep. Present and deeply rested at the same time. The most recent research has taken all of this somewhere that, even a decade ago, would have seemed very far-fetched. In April of 2026, researchers at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine, led by a scientist named Hemal Patel, published findings in a journal called Communications Biology. They'd been studying participants in an intensive week-long program combining meditation and other mind-body practices, and what they found went well beyond what anyone had expected. Just 1 week. But the most striking finding was something else entirely. The brain state produced by this intensive week of meditation was, in its patterns and signatures, remarkably similar to the brain states produced by psychedelic substances. A separate study, published in Neuroscience of Consciousness in early 2026, explored what researchers called brain criticality, a hypothesized state in which the brain is operating at the edge of maximum complexity, balance between too much order and too much chaos. In this state, the brain is thought to be at its most efficient, most responsive, most capable of flexible learning and adaptation. And meditation, the study suggested, is one of the most reliable ways to bring the brain toward this optimal point. Another study, from November of 2025, looked at what happened to participants during a 7-day mind-body retreat. The findings included reduced activity in the default mode network and in the salience network, the part of the brain that decides what is worth paying attention to. And something else, a decrease in what researchers called whole brain modularity. The brain became less fragmented, less divided into separate, siloed regions, more integrated, mess the lace entris. It is hard not to find a kind of poetry in that. The ancient traditions spoke of meditation as a path toward wholeness, toward the dissolution of the sense of being a separate, isolated self surrounded by a hostile world. And now the imaging studies are showing, in the language of neuroscience, that the brain of a meditator becomes, quite literally, more integrated, less fragmented, more integrated. The science and the ancient wisdom are, it seems, describing the same thing. And then there is the story from Thailand in the summer of 2018 that many people remember, but perhaps haven't thought about in quite this way. 12 boys and their football coach were trapped deep inside a flooded cave in northern Thailand. The world watched as rescue divers worked for weeks to find a way to reach them and then a way to bring them out. The conditions were extraordinary, the challenge seemingly impossible. And the boys, in the darkness and the water and the waiting, were calm. Their coach, Ekapol Chantawong, was a former Buddhist monk. He had spent years in a monastery before becoming a coach, and he taught the boys what he knew. He led them in meditation. He showed them how to slow their breathing, how to turn their attention inward, how to find in stillness a resource that the situation itself could not take from them. The boys sat in the dark and they breathed and they waited with a patience that the meditation conserved their energy. It reduced their need for food and water. It kept their stress hormones from flooding their systems in ways that might have been physically catastrophic. And it kept them, by all accounts, psychologically intact through more than 2 weeks of conditions that would have been genuinely overwhelming for most adults. A former monk teaching boys to sit still in the dark. An ancient practice working exactly as it was designed to work. There is something worth sitting with in that. The research on meditation and sleep is, for those of us lying in the dark tonight, perhaps the most immediately relevant. A randomized controlled trial published in 2020 found that training in mindfulness based stress reduction produced small but real and sustained improvements in sleep quality, primarily by decreasing what the researchers called daily disturbance, the quality of the day that carries its turbulence into the night. The mechanism is not mysterious once you understand what meditation does to the brain. The default mode network, that restless inner narrator, is what keeps so many of us awake. The replay of conversations, the anticipation of tomorrow, the low-level hum of worry that persists even when the body is exhausted. Meditation quiets that network, not by force, not by suppressing the thoughts, but by training the brain, over time, to rest more lightly on them, to hold them with less grip. And the brainwaves shift. The beta wave activity of an anxious, active mind gives way to alpha, to theta, to the slow, deep delta waves of restorative sleep. The brain, trained by practice, knows the way to rest more easily. It has walked that path before many times. It knows how to let go. You might not think of yourself as a meditator. You might be someone who has tried it and found your mind too busy, too resistant, too full. That is, interestingly, one of the most common experiences of new meditators, and it is precisely not a sign that the practice isn't working. A busy mind, noticed, is still a noticed mind. The noticing is the practice. Even here, tonight, half listening, drifting in and out of the words, you are doing something that resembles meditation. Letting the ordinary noise of the day recede. Allowing attention to rest softly on something that asks nothing of you. The body settling. The breath slowing. The ancient teachers would recognize what is happening in you right now. The Vedic sages who composed those first texts. The monks who walked the paths of Mount Athos in deep winter. The Sufi poets who wrote about the dissolving of the self into something vast and kind. The young prince who sat beneath the Bodhi tree and refused to move until he found what he was looking for. The researchers in California measuring the brain's response to a week of stillness. They are all, in their different ways, pointing at the same quiet thing. The noise is not the whole of you. Underneath it, there is something older and more patient. Something that doesn't need the day to have gone well in order to be at peace. Something that was there before the first thought this morning and will be there after the last thought tonight. The traditions call it many things. The scientists describe it in the language of brain networks and neurotransmitters. The poets reach for images of vast skies and deep water. But they are all at the end, pointing in the same direction. And so we arrive at the end of a very long journey through a very old story. Behind you, 10,000 years of human beings sitting quietly, turning inward, finding something worth returning to. Somewhere in the Indus Valley, a figure carved in stone, cross-legged still. Somewhere in northern India, a man breathing beneath a tree. Somewhere in Chicago, a young monk saying brothers and sisters, and a hall full of strangers feeling, for a moment, that they were neither. Somewhere in a dark cave in Thailand, 12 boys and their coach breathing in the dark, waiting with a... And here, wherever you are, in whatever hour this is finding you, you carry that same capacity. It has been in you all along, waiting with the patience that very old things have. The stillness is not something you have to build or earn or deserve. It is already underneath the noise, the way deep water is already underneath the surface. You don't have to do anything with that tonight. The day is already distant now. Let it stay there. Drift if you're ready. There is a story told about a Zen master named Bodhidharma, who is said to have carried the teachings of Buddhist meditation from India into China sometime in the 5th or 6th century. The story, like many stories of this kind, has probably been shaped by centuries of retelling, but its core image has endured because it carries something true. Bodhidharma, the story goes, sat in meditation facing a wall for 9 years. Not 9 hours, not 9 days, 9 years. When a student came to him, desperate for teaching, and stood outside in the snow waiting to be acknowledged, Bodhidharma did not turn around. The student, to demonstrate his sincerity, cut off his own arm and presented it. Only then did Bodhidharma turn, and the exchange that followed was brief, almost nothing, a few words. But those few words, transmitted across 15 centuries, became the foundation of an entire school of practice. What the story is really about, beneath its dramatic surface, is the quality of patience that the deepest forms of meditation seem to require and, in time, to cultivate. A willingness to sit with what is without demanding that it be different. A willingness to wait, not because nothing matters, but because the quality of presence you bring to the waiting is itself the practice. Most of us will never sit facing a wall for 9 years. We don't need to. The research suggests that even a few minutes a day, sustained over weeks and months, produces changes in the brain that are real and measurable. But there is something in that image of Bodhidharma, patient and still while the snow fell outside, that points towards something worth carrying into the night. The Japanese tradition that grew from Bodhidharma's teachings, Zen, developed its own particular approach to meditation, called Zazen, which means simply seated meditation. Zen teachers have always been somewhat suspicious of elaborate explanations. If you ask a Zen master what meditation is for, you may receive an answer that seems at first like a riddle. Just sit, they say. Just this. One of the great Zen teachers of the 20th century, a Japanese master named Shunryu Suzuki, came to San Francisco in 1959 and founded what became the San Francisco Zen Center, one of the first Zen communities in the Western world. His talks were eventually collected into a small book called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and it became one of the most widely read books on meditation in any language. His most famous line is the opening one: "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few." He was talking about the quality of fresh attention, the way a child encounters something for the first time, without the overlay of assumption and category and judgment. Meditation, in Suzuki's understanding, was not about reaching an advanced state. It was about continuously returning to the simplicity of now, as if for the first time. Every breath, a first breath. Every moment, encountered as new. That is a gentle and rather beautiful way to approach the end of a day. Whatever today held, you don't have to carry its categories and conclusions into sleep. The mind can be, for these quiet hours, a beginner's mind. Open, unhurried, curious about nothing in particular. There is a woman whose story deserves a moment here because she represents something important about how the contemplative traditions found their way into the modern world through unexpected doors. Her name was Alexandra David Nail, and she was a French explorer and scholar born in 1868, at a time when women were not expected to be either. She was the first Western woman to enter the forbidden city of Lhasa, Tibet, in 1924, disguised as a pilgrim after years of study in Buddhist monasteries. She was 55 years old at the time. She spent 14 years in Asia altogether, studying with lamas and hermits, learning Tibetan, practicing meditation in caves in the Himalayas at altitudes where most people cannot breathe comfortably, let alone sit still. She wrote extensively about what she found, and her books reached readers across Europe who had never heard of Tibetan Buddhism, who had no framework at all for what she was describing, and yet who recognized in her accounts something that resonated. David Nail was not a saint and did not claim to be. She was a scholar and an adventurer, rigorous and sometimes difficult. But she was also someone who had genuinely gone to the places she wrote about, both the outer geography of the Himalayas and the inner geography of sustained contemplative practice. Her books were a bridge. They helped carry something ancient and geographically remote into the imagination of the modern West. And they remind us that the transmission of these practices has always happened through individual human beings, through people who were curious enough and patient enough to make the journey. Not just the physical journey, but the inner one. The long, slow, unglamorous, deeply rewarding journey of sitting down day after day and practicing the art of returning to the present moment. The 1970s brought something else into the story, quieter than the Beatles and Maharishi, but in some ways more lasting in its consequences. A small group of Western practitioners, many of them young Americans who had traveled to Asia in the late 1960s to study meditation in its original settings, returned home with something they wanted to share. Joseph Goldstein had spent years studying Vipassana meditation in India and Burma. Sharon Salzberg had studied in the same tradition. Jack Cornfield had been ordained as a Buddhist monk in Thailand. They came back to America carrying practices that were, by any reasonable measure, thousands of years old, and they began to teach them in the language and context of contemporary Western life. In 1975, Goldstein and Cornfield co-taught the first extended meditation retreat in the United States. In 1976, they helped found the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, a quiet building in the New England countryside that became one of the most influential meditation centers in the Western world. Thousands of people would eventually sit in its retreat halls, learning practices that had traveled from the monasteries of Southeast Asia through the hands of a few dedicated translators of both language and culture into a farmhouse in rural Massachusetts. What Goldstein and Salzberg and Cornfield were teaching was not watered down or simplified. It was the real thing, adapted in its presentation, but not in its essence. And one of its central elements was something that would eventually become the foundation of the clinical research that followed: the practice of mindfulness, of non-judgmental, present-moment awareness. The word mindfulness has since become so widely used that it has, in some contexts, lost its edges. It appears on corporate wellness programs and smartphone apps and cereal boxes. But, in its original sense, in the Pali word sati, from which it derives, it means something specific and rich. It means remembering to be present. Not a passive state, but an active returning. The mind wanders, as it always will, and mindfulness is the quality that notices the wandering and brings the attention gently back. Not with frustration, not with self-criticism. That quality of patient self-kindness is, interestingly, one of the things the research has identified as central to the benefits of meditation. It is not just the attention training that matters. It is the relationship you develop, through practice, with your own inner experience. Less struggle, less resistance, less of the exhausting effort to make your thoughts and feelings be different from what they are. More willingness to let things arise and pass in their own time, the way weather passes through a landscape that is large enough to hold it. Sharon Salzberg has written and spoken at length about a particular aspect of this, what she calls loving kindness, meditation, or metta, from the Pali word for benevolence or goodwill. In this practice, the practitioner extends a quality of warmth and well-wishing, first toward themselves, then gradually outward to others, to loved ones, to neutral people, to difficult people, to all beings without exception. But the research on loving-kindness meditation is striking. It produces increases in positive emotions, in the sense of social connection, in physical health markers. A study led by Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina found that loving-kindness meditation increased participants' experience of positive emotions day by day, and that these increases over time built what she called psychological resources, resilience, mindfulness, a sense of meaning, reduced illness symptoms. And perhaps most quietly important of all, the people who practiced it began to feel less alone, less separate, less like isolated points of consciousness moving through an indifferent world, more connected to the vast, patient fact of other human beings, all of them carrying their own weight, all of them doing their best with what they have. That is, when you think about it, a rather profound thing to happen from sitting still. There is a researcher named Richard Davidson whose work deserves a longer moment here. Davidson is a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and he has spent much of his career studying the neural basis of emotion, particularly what he calls affective style, the characteristic way an individual's brain responds to positive and negative experience. In the early part of his career, he was advised by colleagues to keep his interest in meditation quiet, to not pursue it as a serious research topic because it would damage his credibility. He pursued it anyway. In 2001, Davidson and his colleagues brought a remarkable research participant into his laboratory. His name was Mathieu Ricard, a French monk who had spent decades in Tibetan Buddhist monasteries and was, by any measure, one of the most experienced meditators in the world. They attached 256 electrodes to Ricard's scalp and asked him to meditate on compassion. What they recorded was unlike anything they had seen before. Ricard's brain, during compassion meditation, showed extraordinary levels of high-amplitude gamma-wave activity, the fastest and most complex of the brain's oscillations, associated with heightened perception, conscious awareness, and what some researchers describe as the binding of disparate brain regions into a coherent whole. Over the following years, Davidson and his colleagues studied dozens of long-term meditators, many of them Tibetan monks with tens of thousands of hours of practice. The findings were consistent. The brains of experienced meditators were structurally and functionally different from those of non-meditators in ways that pointed in a single direction toward greater capacity for positive emotion, toward reduced reactivity to stress, toward a quality of awareness that was simultaneously more alert and more at rest. Davidson coined a phrase for what he found in the most experienced meditators: a high positive hedonic baseline, a resting state of well-being. Not happiness in the ordinary sense of pleasurable experience, but something deeper and more stable. A quality of okayness that persisted regardless of circumstances, that could hold difficulty without being undone by it. Ricard, who has been the subject of more brain studies than almost any other meditator alive, has spoken about this with characteristic modesty. He does not claim to be immune to difficulty or pain. He has experienced loss and hardship. But the quality of his relationship to those experiences is different from the ordinary one. The gap between the arising of difficulty and the response to it is, through decades of practice, wide enough to contain a considered choice. Wide enough sometimes to contain compassion for himself and for others in the midst of it. Davidson's research eventually led him to a conclusion that he found, as a scientist, both exciting and somewhat humbling. Well-being, he argued, is a skill, not a trait you are born with or without, not a fixed point on a spectrum determined by genetics and circumstance. A skill, one that can be trained, one that the brain, given the right kind of practice, will develop in measurable biological ways. That is a genuinely hopeful finding, not hopeful in a shallow, everything will be fine way. Hopeful in the deeper sense. There is one more voice worth hearing before this long journey comes to its quiet end. Her name was Tara Brach, and she trained as a clinical psychologist before becoming a meditation teacher in the Theravada Buddhist tradition. For decades, she has worked with people who come to meditation carrying not just stress or sleeplessness, but something heavier, the deep, persistent sense that they are somehow not enough, that there is something fundamentally wrong with them that needs to be fixed before they can be at peace. She calls this the trance of unworthiness, and she writes about it with a precision and a gentleness that suggests she knows it from the inside. The trance is the background hum of self-judgment that many of us carry so constantly that we no longer notice it, the way you stop noticing the sound of a refrigerator until it turns off, and the silence is suddenly, unexpectedly, peaceful. What meditation offers, in Brach's understanding, is not a technique for fixing what is wrong, but a practice of radical acceptance of what is. Not a passive resignation, not giving up, but a genuine willingness to meet your own experience with the same quality of open, non-judgmental attention you might offer a dear friend who is suffering. To let the difficulty be what it is, without the added weight of the story that says it shouldn't be this way, that you shouldn't feel this way, that a better person wouldn't be in this situation. That quality of acceptance, which sounds so simple and is so rarely practiced, is, in Brach's clinical experience and in the research that supports her work, one of the most healing things a human being can offer themselves. And it is available right now, in this moment, in whatever state you find yourself in. The tiredness is allowed. The worry is allowed. The sadness, if it's there, is allowed. You don't have to earn your way out of it before you can rest. The ancient teachers knew this. It runs through all the traditions we have traveled through tonight, from the Vedic sages to the Hesychast monks to the Sufi poets to the neuroscientists measuring gamma waves in a laboratory in Wisconsin. The stillness underneath the noise is not conditional. It does not require you to be different from what you are. It is already there, patient as deep water, waiting for the surface to settle enough that you can feel it. Some nights the surface settles easily. Some nights it takes longer. Some nights you fall asleep before it settles at all, and that is fine too, perhaps even better, the body taking what it needs without waiting for permission. The practice, if you want to call it that, is simply this: lying here in the dark, letting the day recede, not forcing it, not trying to achieve anything, just allowing the weight of the body to be held, the breath to slow, the thoughts to drift and thin like mist over water in the early morning. You are in very old company tonight. 10,000 years of human beings who lay down in the dark and did the same,